Welcome to the Nathan Denison house in 40 Fort, Pennsylvania. We would like to take you on a tour of the house today to show what life was like in Wyoming Valley over 200 years ago. We do have a miniature butter churn and a larger one over there. Butter churns were very common, very important, because in those days you didn't drink the milk from the cow, usually. Your beverages were usually water or fruit juice. Sometimes alcoholic beverages too. And so what they did with the milk usually was to get the cream out of it, letting the cream rise to the top, skimming it off, and then placing the cream in the butter churns and churning it until it became butter. And butter was very common. We used large amounts of butter were used. Right here we have an example of the most common type of spinning wheel. In Nathan Denison's day, this was known as the walking wheel or the wool wheel. And it had no pedal, so you had to keep, or somebody had to keep turning the wheel by hand while the rough wool or flax was then pulled and stretched onto the bobbin in order to make thread. Wool, of course, when it's in a finished product, we still call it wool. Flax, when we turn it into its finished product, the thread, and what that's woven into, we then call that linen. And those were the two most common fabrics of the day that they would produce themselves or could be easily gotten, wool and linen. Cotton would have been available from overseas at a higher price, or from the American South at that time at an even higher price than the one gotten from overseas. Cotton as a cheap, inexpensive fabric would not become available until around the 1810s or the 1820s, after Denison had died. Right here we have the box in which the dough was placed to rise before baking. It probably would have been closer to the fire where the warmth was, but we keep it over here to keep it so we wouldn't trip over it. Another item they would have made by themselves from animal tallow or animal fat was candles. And right here we have an example of two candles held together by a wick. And this is the way they would have been produced. And the way you would produce them was similar to the way that soap was. You would take the animal fat and put it in a cauldron under a fire outdoors. The only difference was you wouldn't put any lye in it. Instead, you would have these wicks, probably of linen or some other fabric, and you would then hold it like an upside down U shape. Now the candle would not be on it yet. There wouldn't be any towel on it, just that. And you would dip that into the cauldron. And some of the bubbling fat would then coat the lower part of both of these strands. And then you would take that and place that on a long string, sort of like a clothesline today, and then take the next one of these cords off there and dip that into the cauldron, and it would coat the lower part of each. And you would place that back on the clothesline device in order to have it cool off. And you would go down and do that with every one. You could have had 20, 30, 40, 50 of them if you wanted to. And then when you got to the last one and dipped it and then replaced it on the line, you would then go back to the first one, take that one off and dip it again. And another coat would appear on the lower part of each one of these strands. And then you would replace it and go down again and again. And maybe after who knows how many times, 20 times for each one, it would finally reach the size you're looking for. And then you would simply cut the cord here and then trim it down to the size you wanted. So you're making 2 at a time. It saves time for you instead of just dipping 1 at a time. Another way that you could have made candles was by using a mold in which you would place a stick with a cord, the wick tied to it, and it would descend down into these hollow tubes. And then you would pour the animal fat down the tube and fill each one up like they are here. That's a lot easier than dipping. The only problem is it never usually made a perfect candle, because now you have to get it out. After the wax hardens, you have to get it out of here. So you could cool it in colder water or give it a couple of taps. Many times what would happen is the candle would just break inside. You would get half of a candle coming out. And also, when the cord goes down in there and you pour the tallow in, sometimes as the tallow would go down, the cord would drift to one side. It wouldn't be right in the center. And so your candles would, the wick as it burned down would tend to move from one side of the candle to the other. And that wouldn't have any effect on the efficiency of the candle, but it would aesthetically not look proper. So most people would not use this. This was a nice device that most people did not want to use. In fact, the professional candle makers called chandlers in that day, they always dipped because there was no other way to guarantee a perfect candle that the people are obviously going to pay for and are going to be upset if it doesn't look right. And then your candles would be stored somewhere so that the mice couldn't get at them. Now, you might say, why would mice want to get at a candle? Well, because it's animal fat. That's nourishment. And this was one of the devices that they used to keep the candle safe. In fact, that's exactly what it was called, a candle safe. And you would open it up, and in there would be candles of various sorts. Various colors too, because as I said, the color of the tallow would affect the color of the candle. It's made of metal so that the mouse or the mice could not eat through it. Its position here is probably enough to make it safe, even if it wasn't metal, even if it was just a platform. But then again, you know, mice are very clever. They could probably jump from somewhere to it. Possibly. And this one, though, I can put that on the floor, and the mice still couldn't eat through the metal. So that's how they kept the candles in good condition and not end up half-eaten by mice. On the wall here, we have displayed several herbs in dried condition. Usually an herb was dried before it could be used, but not always. And they would be dried by the fireplace. After they were in their dried condition, they, of course, could be kept here. The first one we have here is lavender. This is used as a strewing herb. It was strewn or thrown on the floors of the home, probably in the corners to get out of the way, but also under tables and other places like that. Sometimes even directly on the floor so people could walk on them. And as they would walk on them and crush them, that would also allow the fragrance to fill the air. Lavender was also used in soap for a fragrance. This next herb is sage. It's in its dried condition, as all of these are, so most people looking at them here might not recognize them. But this is sage. It was used to flavor food and also as a tooth whitener. This is basil. Also a strewing herb that would be thrown through the house, and also as a flavoring. The center one here is bee balm, also known as monarda or bergamot. That was used as a medicinal preparation for sore throats. You would dry it out like it is now and then mix it with water and drink it. Right here we have peppermint. And that was used for flavoring, and also mixed in a concoction with water for indigestion, as it's sometimes used today for. And finally, we have dill. That was used for pickling to give a flavor to the pickles and other food preparations. But also, it was the seeds were taken to church and eaten, chewed during the service. And that was to suppress appetite. And so you won't be thinking about the meal you're going to get in the future at noontime. You're probably going to listen to the preacher's sermon. And also, it would tend to keep you awake. And therefore, it was known as church seed or meeting house seed. And then finally, on the wall, over the pantry, we have a very important item, and that is the musket, the hunting musket. Now, that particular musket is a reproduction of a French military musket that was used by Americans during the Revolutionary War. Now, that's not a hunting musket, but as it turns out, the hunting musket that Nathan Denison would have used would have been very similar to that, except that some of the metal parts would be brass instead of iron. And Nathan Denison, of course, would use that for protection and also for hunting, and he would have taught his sons how to hunt. And it is known as a flintlock musket. That's because it has a piece of flint in the jaws of this lever, and that flint strikes this metal lever here when it's closed over this platform to create sparks that cause the gunpowder to explode and fire the bullets. And the gunpowder was carried by the hunters in a powder horn. And this is an original powder horn going back to those early times. And it is actually the horn of a cow, which has been boiled, and then the interior parts have been removed until it becomes a hollow enough to store powder. And the bag hanging from it here is known as the shot bag, that you would carry the little lead balls that you would make yourself and also be then fired from the musket at the game. This is called a rushlight. If a candle would not be available, they would take bulrushes near the river, dry them out, and place them in this spring here. You would get quite a bit of bulrushes and put them in here, dry bulrushes, and they would be held in place, and you could light them, and it would give off light. It would create more of an odor in the home, and it wouldn't last as long as a candle, but it was a cheap way of creating light. This is known as a bedroom. Very unusual because the upper story bedrooms were usually called bed chambers. This was used as a sick room. It could also be used as a birthing room, a place where the mother would give birth to the children. And it could also be used, as we said, a simple bedroom for, let's say, a person who couldn't get around too well, who couldn't walk upstairs. And this type of bed that we have in this room is typical of the beds in the home. And we see the blanket on top, and then we see underneath a mattress. And as I press on the mattress, listen for the sound you hear. Now, if you can hear that, that is the sound of human fingers pressing against straw. Dried straw that was placed inside what would be like a big pillow, and that served as the mattress. And it's supported not by a box spring or anything like that. It's supported by ropes. And this was the typical bed of the day. And notice how they're wrapped around these different knobs on either side. And you could tighten them in several ways, either by actually tightening knots in them, or sometimes they would have a device like this. It looks like a big screw, and there would be a tool that would go into it, and you would crank it, and that would turn the knobs, and it would make it tighter or looser, depending on how much support you wanted. And of course, after a number of years, you're going to have to tighten it anyway, because the ropes would begin to sag. And this is where we get the expression, good night, sleep tight, don't let the bed bugs bite. Well, we know what good night means, but sleep tight meant to have the ropes tightened to the proper tension to give you a good night's sleep. And of course, the bed bugs, they were inevitable. They were all over in colonial times. And here we have what is known as the blanket box, sometimes the dowry chest or the cedar chest that was used to store clothing. Closet space was not used for clothing. Sometimes clothes would be hung on pegs on the walls, but normally it would be kept in boxes like this. I'm walking up the staircase to the second story, and you'll notice how it curves at the beginning, and the steps are very narrow on one side as you make that turn, so you have to be very careful. Once you make the turn, the steps become normal size and you're safer. This is the master bedroom, or the master bed chamber as they would call it. And in it we see several items that would be important to slumber in those days, and that is the large four-poster bed for the master of the home and his wife, Nathan Denison, and Betsy Denison would have slept in a bed like this, possibly a little bit higher off the ground than it is there. And also a cradle would have been in the room for the youngest child, so any of its needs could be attended to during the night quite easily. The bed is draped with coverings on either side and on the back and the front, and that they can be untied and closed or opened to create or dissipate heat. Also, it's for privacy because you have to go through this bed chamber to get to the next one. This one also has a fireplace, one of the 5 in the house. We saw 3 fireplaces downstairs. There are 2 upstairs. This is one. Notice how much smaller it is because it was not used to the extent that the ones downstairs were. And on the bed we have an interesting item. Here is known as a hunting shirt. It's a heavy linen outer garment worn by the men. And we know that at the capitulation after the Battle of Wyoming, Nathan Denison wore a hunting shirt like this. We have documented evidence that he did. Not this one, but something like it. In fact, the Indians wanted to take it from him for themselves, and he didn't want to give it up, and they threatened to kill him. And a 16-year-old girl, in fact, the daughter of Thomas Bennett, the one whose table was the capitulation was signed on, she went up to Nathan Denison and said, "Nathan Denison, please give them your hunting shirt. Don't let them kill you." And she said, "Here, I will help you untie the laces at the cuffs." Now, this does not have any laces at the cuffs, but some of them did in order to tighten or loosen it in that area. Also, we have a sword. Now, this is a modern day reproduction, but Nathan Denison would have carried something like this on a sling and in a scabbard, and it would be a sign of his rank. And he held the rank of colonel of the militia. Colonels, of course, would not have carried muskets like the everyday soldier. They would simply have carried a sword as a sign of rank and also as protection if they needed any. But they would not have actually fought in the battle with a musket. They would have just given commands. And also here we see clothing of the time period, breeches, which would have been the pants of the day, and the hat, known as the tricorn hat, meaning 3 corners. The hat is normally has a round dome or crown, and it has a wide brim which can be laced up onto the crown, creating that 3-corner look, which was very typical of that day. If you look at the items in this room, they don't really give you an idea about what this room was used for. In reality, this was a grain storage room, believe it or not. But what we use it for today is to give an idea about the fabrics of the day. Right here we have a counter, probably from the time beyond Nathan Denison, and it was used to determine the length of the yarn that was produced as it was wound around the device. Over here we have a model of a loom. In those days, the looms that would have been used to weave the various yarn and thread into fabrics would have been probably 5 times that size. It'd be as big as the room itself, but this is simply a model of it. And each family would not have had one. You would have had several people in the community that would have had the looms, and you would go to them and pay them to weave your thread or your yarn into a piece of fabric. And over on the wall here we have various things hanging. This looks like human hair. It actually is not, and I'll get to that in a second. This is the first thing we'd be interested in. I'm going to turn it around. This is what the flax plant looks like. This is dried flax. That's F-L-A-X. Every farmer here would have grown about an acre of this. It would grow in the ground. It would be a darker color than this when it was fresh. But what you would do then, after it dried out, is you would use a device called a cane brake, and you would smash these filaments, these little thin stems. And when they would break apart, out from inside would come this. Now, this is tangled up here. It shouldn't be here, but this would come out from each of these filaments. This is known as tow, T-O-W. That's unspun linen. It's linen before it's spun into linen. And if when you collected enough of it, you could get a large amount that looks sort of like a wig. But then that was used on the different spinning wheels in order to make linen thread. These small nodules on the top are the containers for flax seed. Flax seed was used obviously for next year's crop of flax, but a salve could be made from it to help get out splinters or slivers. And once you had the tow, you then spun it on a spinning wheel like the one we saw downstairs, which was more common in Denison's day, or on this type, which was just about invented around the time of Nathan Denison. This is the smaller one, the smaller spinning wheel that worked with a pedal. So you could actually sit down and do your weaving. And one person could do all the work very easily on it. But like I said, in Denison's day, that was very rare. It was just coming into usage. And you would then spin the tow into thread, and then it was called linen, and it would then be woven on a loom into fabric. The fabric would be cut with a pattern and then sewed together to make a finished garment. And over here, this uniform that we have displayed here would be like the uniform that would have been worn by soldiers from Wyoming Valley who fought the British during the Revolutionary War in George Washington's army. And it would be particularly the kind that would have been used at the very end of the war. So that when these men returned from the war in 1783, they would have come home in a uniform like this. And the reason it's that particular color, blue and white, is because blue, by the end of the war, had become the standard American uniform color. And the white trim is on there to signify New England. And of course, people living in Wyoming Valley at the time of the Revolution were from New England, like Nathan Denison was. In fact, Wyoming Valley was considered Connecticut at that time by right of arms. They had defeated the Pennsylvanians, who were also interested in it. And in fact, on some old maps, you will see this part of Pennsylvania, known as northeastern Pennsylvania today. You will see it on some old maps indicated as Connecticut, even though at that time it had not been officially determined who owned it. And eventually, by a court decision, it was determined that Pennsylvania's claim was better, and so it became Pennsylvania as it is today. But that's the coat they would have worn, something like that when they would have returned from the war.
I don't like to go to school hungry. I'm embarrassed that I don't have my lunch.
I get tired when I don't eat.
Hunger is unkind.
Hunger is unfair.
Hunger is uncool.
Hunger is everyone's problem.
Hunger is unloving, uncaring, unacceptable, unimaginable.
Hunger is you.
Hunger is me.
Hunger is all of us.
Help undo hunger for America's children. Go to hungeris.org.
Together, we can make a difference.